Welcome to Wisp Sports' new podcast, Talking Point. My name is Lisa Ingarfield, and I'm going to be your host for what I hope to be a thought-provoking and challenging discussion as we explore all things women and gender equity in sport. I actually hail from the United Kingdom, but I've lived in the US now for 14 years. I got my master's degree and my doctorate here in the States, and it was really when I arrived in the US that I started to think more deeply about women and their role in our culture and their role in sports. In particular, the ways in which unequal treatment and inequity manifests. I write a lot. I love to write, and I write for a publication in Denver called The Broadview Denver, which is dedicated to issues related to women and girls. And I also write for a local publication dealing with triathlon, as I am an amateur triathlete, and I try my best at that sport and love to engage in that way. And so triathlon was really where I entered this conversation around women's role in sport and why this podcast came to be. So the goal of this show and why I think it's really important is because we need to be having a deeper conversation about diversity and inclusion when it comes to women's role in sport. There have been multiple calls for equitable treatment of women, and many of those have been fairly loud recently, particularly around pay and prize money in various sports disciplines. But often the conversation just stops there. It blows up in the media and people get outraged and get engaged, and then it fades away and we don't really do anything about it until the next time. And so we really want this podcast to be a means for folks to engage and maintain that conversation and keep moving this issue forward so we don't lose sight of it. So one of the big goals of this podcast is to start that conversation with you and have you engage. We want to hear your questions and your thoughts and topic ideas that you might have. So please engage with us on Facebook or on Twitter. We would love to hear your thoughts. Today's episode, the very first episode of Talking Point, we're going to lay the foundation for the discussions to come. We're going to talk broadly about how women experience marginalization in our culture and how sexism continues to play such a formidable role in our society. And we hope that this will give you the language and the understanding that as we dive deeper in later podcasts into particular areas of sports and athletics, that you will start to understand this issue and how deep the problems run. So joining me today for our first discussion on this issue is Joanna Snawder-Manzo, an expert in women and gender studies. We're very excited to have Joanna with us. She has worked in the field of women and gender for over 17 years and has extensive experience addressing issues facing women on college campuses and beyond. She's done work on wage discrimination, Title IX compliance, and also in women's leadership. She is a certified Start Smart salary negotiation workshop facilitator and women's empowerment model self-defense instructor. She considers herself a social justice warrior and an enduring feminist. So we're very happy to have her on the show today. Well, welcome Joanna Snawder-Manzo to the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I think we're going to jump right in. And I was wondering if you could share your thoughts with us about this the individual versus the system. I think sometimes it's easy for us to blame individuals for their bad behavior, right? So this person, they were just behaving badly, and we shy away from or refuse to take a step back and look at individual behavior as part of a larger system when we're talking about the marginalization of women and sexism in general. So I was wondering if you could just share your thoughts about that.
Sure. So I think that happens a lot, and it's very normal and natural when we experience a microaggression or a slight or in some way internalize a feeling that we might tag as marginalization, discrimination, being left out based on gender. It's easier to focus on the individual because that's the person we're in relationship with, and that's the person who we experienced it from, and we can internalize those feelings. And when we do that, and I think that's an important process, but it doesn't take into account how systems are pervasive and are upholding the right to behave in that way and the right to treat others in that way. And it can almost be daunting and overwhelming to think about the entire system. If I'm only thinking about this one person that I work with, then I might feel like I have a little more power, interpersonal power in that situation to kind of overcome, okay, it's just this one jerk, this one person that thinks that way. And it's not as overwhelming when I think about all of these ideologies being embedded in our culture and much more difficult to unravel and to think about, because I don't feel like I have power against a whole system and a way of thinking. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah,
and I think that we're socialized and we're brought up in a culture that really supports that individual blame versus taking a look at these larger structures and systems that support the behavior. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially in the U.S., where it's all about the individual, and there's this idea that we can sort of individually overcome any hardship. And sure, in certain ways we can, and we also want to always support people to strive for whatever their goals and accomplishments are. And there are very real systems, interlocking systems that make it challenging. And it's important, I think, to recognize those systems, because people can feel like they are just banging their head against the wall trying to have advancement in their career or in their education or in their particular sport. And by acknowledging those systems, you kind of relieve a little bit of that pressure from, oh, it's not just you. You're not just the person that's not being strong enough, fighting hard enough, being smart enough, all of this, that there are actually systems at work that are kind of denying that access.
I'm thinking about access. Your comments made me think about wage discrimination and also the number of women leaders that exist in industries, across all disciplines. So whether that's sports or whether that's business, marketing, right? We know that a tiny percentage of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women. And we also know that within the sports industry, there are very few women coaches, very few women in leadership roles. And I know that you are a Smart Start salary negotiator. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, like that's one tangible system, right? Employment and wage discrimination and women in leadership roles, and what your thoughts are around why those issues continue to persist.
Yeah, that is a really great and complex question, and there's no simple answer. I think, and thinking about so much of even work that is considered has been feminized over time, right? So education used to be more of a male-dominated field. Now it's more of a female-dominated field. And then you look at the disparity in how education is funded and how teachers are paid. And then, there's a number of other fields where that has manifested as well. And with the Fortune 500 leadership, I actually heard quite recently, in recent years, the number has actually gone down for the number of women. It was just a skosh higher. So that's a little disheartening to think about progress not continually progressing, but actually regressing in some ways. With the wage disparity, this is just such a vast topic because you can look at gender, but you can also look at other aspects of identity like race and ethnicity, educational background, so on and so forth. And I think that there are areas of improvement, like we've seen the wage gap, just to even identify it, to discuss it, just to acknowledge that it exists. I remember when I was working at St. Mary's College in the Women's Center, one of my students was at a workshop across the hall and she came running over all excited. She said, Joanna, we just went in this workshop and we learned that the wage gap is real. It actually exists. And I said, yes, that's what we've been saying. And so now that you have that knowledge, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to be motivated, to make a change? And so that's where I think the workshops and all of the work around wage negotiation to educate women and men and gender nonconforming people on what role they can actually play in their own negotiation and empowering them with those tools and resources. And really, I think looking at the numbers, I think the numbers, are there. You see it right before you. It's so vast. And, the numbers have changed a little bit in recent years. I remember when we would do equal pay day rallies in April. And now I saw this past year, it backed up to towards the end of March. And so equal pay day is representative of how far into the following year that a woman would have to work to make the same salary that a man made in a year. So think about that, right? So we go full calendar year and then push into April. So yeah, it's backing up a little bit. And so we're seeing some changes, but it's still a great, great disparity. And so you think about the impact of that wage discrimination and how it manifests in a woman's life. And what I would say when I was doing the workshops, this affects men and gender nonconforming people too, because, hey, men, do you have a partner? Do you have a mother? Do you have a sister? Are you contributing to that household or benefiting from that household that is not maximizing the income and the wages that you could be receiving for your healthcare, for your food, for your expenses? Don't you want the maximum to happen? So I think making it tangible, making it real, and showing people what kind of options they have to make a change. But it's almost this whole, I like using the example of the David and Goliath parable, because it's so monumental. It's so widespread. So we, I think, need some very structural changes in the way that wage discrimination happens, in companies and education and our hiring practices, recruitment practices, to really address it.
Yeah, and I think it's often denied, right? I was just on Facebook a few months ago, and a friend of mine posted something to the effect of, is this wage discrimination or wage disparity between men and women real? Like, does it happen? So in 2017, and she's a woman, an older woman, so not a millennial or someone who's in their teens or early 20s. And then there was a barrage of comments, and I would say probably 85% of the comments were like, absolutely it does. But there were certain individuals, that small minority of people, who responded with, nope, not in my company, not in my field, that doesn't really happen anymore. And I just think there's this propensity to deny that it happens, or back to our earlier conversation around, well, it's just in this one company, right? It's not a widespread problem.
Absolutely. And you were reminding me, Lisa, of a couple of years ago when the recession hit. It seems like it's always kind of coming in waves. And there were a lot of articles written about how it negatively impacted men in the workplace, that the men were the ones losing their jobs. And so that was sort of the angle of the rhetoric. But my question was, well, why not look at why the men were the expendable portion of the workplace? Look at the salary disparity. If you have X amount of work that you need to get done, and your female identified employees are actually able to accomplish that work at a lower pay rate, and we're in a recession and it's about the bottom line, right? We wish it would be multiple bottom lines, but sometimes it's not. It's just about money. So who is the most expendable in terms of pay rate and workload? So I think that was missing in that conversation.
Gosh, I hadn't even thought about that, but that makes total sense, right? If you're paying a group of people less, then they're the folks that you're going to likely keep on in employment because it's more cost effective for you.
And if the work that they're doing is larger.
Right.
The ratio there. So.
Right. Thinking, this just kind of entrees or makes me think about some of the struggles that have happened recently, or have been, I'll reframe that. They're not struggles that have happened recently. They're struggles that have been made public recently. Between athletic teams, men and women's athletic teams that are being paid, the women's teams are being paid less. There was obviously a huge outcry around the women's U.S. soccer team. They won the World Cup and their payout was significantly less than the men's team that didn't even, I think, make it to the semifinals. And then most recently, the women's U.S. ice hockey team said that they were going to boycott the World Championships if their pay and compensation beyond just pay was not comparable to the men, and US ice hockey buckled in the end because there was a lot of support, external support from other entities, including the men's ice hockey team, about their requests. And so we are seeing this wage discrimination and this disparity spreading across all disciplines, right? And so when we think about sports and athletics, it's definitely there. But what this leads me into thinking about is the justification that can exist around women in sport in particular, which taps into a larger conversation around women's value and women's place in certain spaces. Well, women's sport isn't as interesting. Women's sport isn't as exciting. Folks don't want to watch women's sport, right? And so we can see that narrative manifest in different ways. But I feel like that is absolutely connected to the justification as to why women are paid less in athletics and sport, but are also paid less in other industries too.
Well, and speaking of women in sport, I would argue that we haven't even been given the opportunity as a society to fully embrace, advocate, support, and allow women the center stage to, to develop as a society. So that could be like the pushback. But I think about, again, when I was working at St. Mary's, I made a point of going to see the women's basketball team play, and there would be a lot less attendees and in the crowd, but they also had a lot less focus, attention, budget, promotional materials, so on and so forth. So if there had been parity sort of in that way, or even, if it's not parity, just a little bit closer, how could that have changed people's ability and willingness to engage? So I don't think we've been given that opportunity yet. And I think it's really important that we all continue to ask for it and demand it and bring, attention to the disparities. And then in other arenas, I'm thinking about kind of back to the CEOs and the small numbers. And I don't, have a lot of knowledge about that area. I work in education. It's very different. But I'm curious about what leadership paradigm women need to adopt in order to advance to those levels.
Right.
And sort of what that looks like, right? And so there can be a very stereotypical kind of male-dominated command and control or power and control hierarchical model. Or in education, we talk a lot about like consensus building and collaboration and working together. And that style might be attributed more to a stereotypical female leadership model. And I know that leadership model, the second one I mentioned, benefits everybody. Not necessarily a leader, right? It's consensus building. It's people coming together to work together to achieve a goal. But I think it's really challenging because we have our political systems at play that we see in the media. And of course, we're sort of replicating those systems within our own sphere of influence, whether that be education, sports, business, what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point you raised here is critical around leadership style, this assumption that I think we make as a culture that to be an effective leader isn't genderless, right? To be an effective leader takes on traits or what we might perceive to be masculine traits. Thus, the natural conclusion, therefore, is that men are better leaders, or women and folks who don't identify in the binary have to take on those traits in order to be perceived as successful or credible. And so that's troubling, right? When we think about wanting to diversify our workplaces and diversifying the way that we do business.
Right, and I think that goes back to what you were speaking about earlier, the individual versus the systemic, because it's that whole, a charismatic leader model, right? The great man that's going to unite us and bind us all together. And I get frustrated sometimes with critiques of our leadership on campus, like the president of the university, or even our current administration with my peers and colleagues, because I think, well, yeah, you can criticize an individual all day, but what are you doing? What are we doing to contribute and make change and ask for change? Because we are many. We have a voice. So if we don't like the way that something looks, then what is our responsibility in finding other similar voices and working to that end? Because I think we need to remember that the leaders work for us.
Right. Do you think that comes back to socialization around gender roles? Go ahead, sorry.
Well, that's intriguing. Say more about that.
Well, I'm just wondering in terms of our women's capacity to mobilize, and if a problem is identified, then thinking about how do we connect as a community to push back and hold leaders more accountable or request changes in structures. And so if women are generally socialized to be less assertive, because there's pushback, right? When a woman is assertive or demands certain changes, then often what follows is a slew of backlash terms, right? I'm just thinking about how to say that. That can be problematic, that silence women. And so I'm wondering if you have this kind of group think in a way, because women are socialized in a certain way to be more demure, quieter, take up less space, not be as quote unquote aggressive, perhaps as men might be. And then that permeates systemically, culturally, and which then limits or restricts women's capacity to join together and mobilize for change.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something around the socialization and the assertiveness, and just knowing that there's so many women who are assertive and will assert their voices, and there's a consequence to that. And the consequence could be, kind of peer-based, being isolated, people like not wanting to associate because you don't want to be the loudest voice or the squeaky wheel. Or, I'm thinking of a very powerful example of being an undergraduate and always speaking up in class. And I eventually transferred to a women's college, but I had gone to co-ed education, K-12, started college. That was just my experience. And so I remember being in college and really challenging some of my male co-students. And after class, a woman coming up to me from the class, a peer, saying, "Thank you so much for speaking up about whatever the issue is." And I said, "Well, of course." I said, "But you should too. It's lonely up there. And to know that you feel similarly and that you could speak out also in solidarity with me, I think would make a huge difference. So please use your voice."
Yeah, using your voice. I was at a conference recently, an endurance coaching conference, and there was a panel of business leaders in coaching, and 2 of the 3 were women, which was a positive thing, right? Because I didn't anticipate that. And a young woman in the audience stood up and asked the women leaders about how she could handle both sexism and ageism that she's experienced as a younger woman coach. She has found that she's often dismissed by men seeking coaches, or the assumption that she doesn't know enough or she's not going to be effective. And the response from the women on the panel was really disappointing. And it was just, well, you probably don't want to coach them anyway if they're going to be like that. There wasn't really any larger conversation or discussion about, well, who else in the room perhaps has had that experience, or I remember a time when. And so this younger woman who'd stood up and asked the question felt completely isolated, and I caught up with her afterwards and got some more information, but she was just kind of like hanging out there. And, no one joined in. And I'm 100% sure that as a young woman coach, she was not alone in having those experiences, and her age just exacerbated the way that she was treated. You know, and it's troubling, isn't it?
It is, and it goes again back to this individual versus the systemic, right? Putting it back on this sort of scapegoat mentality. Well, you wouldn't want to coach them anyway, versus no, we have a larger societal problem here that we're not addressing, because, and I think people, you know, can do that a lot, where we can attribute to a group of individuals or an individual without looking at the system, but it keeps happening over and over in our lives. We get shown these examples. So when are we collectively going to stop ignoring that and chalking it up to an isolated incident and look at, well, what is going on at the larger level, and where do I fit into that, and what power do I have? And it's overwhelming. I mean, I feel very strongly about gender equality, and I have to think about every day. I think I was sharing with you before this call, being at work and thinking about, you know, whose voice is the loudest at a table in a meeting, and how much time is given to a particular voice. And I challenge the listeners today, and next time you're in a meeting, start timing people. And then, yeah, I did it in a meeting the other day. I shared with Lisa, and it was a really interesting discovery. Like, see how long people talk, and who's talking for how long, and who's listening, and what are they saying. And then you do have the power to challenge, to push back, to ask questions. But you do have to kind of make that determination of when it's risky, when it feels a little safer, and what the ramifications could be for you. Because you know, at the workplace, that might be a little bit more of a choose your battle situation. But in your personal life, or kind of in a business set, or, you know, when you're in control, like, for example, as a consumer, we have choices. I recently stopped. I was a member of a certain organization. It was a club that offered a product. And I found out, I shouldn't have found out, but I found out indirectly from an employee how the owner of the company voted. And based on that decision, I stopped my membership. You know why? Because I had the power to do that. Those are my consumer dollars. I can do whatever I want with my consumer dollars. So, and, you know, I still never wrote them and told them why, but I've contemplated that as well. So thinking about when there are opportunities for us to have power to actually make change.
That's such a great point, Joanna, and I think that that's really going to be helpful for listeners to take something tangible away, because I think it can feel overwhelming when you really start to think about the depth and breadth of women's marginalization and the sexism that we experience. We do have consumer power, right? And so where are we putting our money and our voices in terms of supporting agencies, entities, organizations, businesses, sports, or otherwise, you know, who are truly working to rectify some of the issues that we've been talking about in this podcast? And, you know, when I think about the Ironman company, it's a large triathlon company. And there's an ongoing struggle with them related to their world championships and the number of professional women slots that they have for this championship race. They have 50 slots for men and 35 for women. And they have thus far been fairly unwilling to engage in a conversation about the inequity in that, and have proffered numerous explanations, including proportionality, right? So women's slots are awarded based on the proportional representation of women in the larger Ironman brand races. Well, you're not getting to the root of the problem there, that there are less women that are participating in Ironman brand races. Why is that, right? So that doesn't really solve the issue. But so thinking about that as a tangible item, so then don't pay to participate in Ironman races if you disagree with the way that they're treating their women professional athletes. And there are probably hundreds of examples like that, both inside and outside of sports. that would enable women and folks of other gender identities to say, I don't agree with the way that you're addressing these inequities, and so I'm just not going to put my money there. And I think that can speak loudly if enough people do it, right?
Exactly. And I love when I hear examples of people creating their own options. I'm affiliated with a couple of groups that were disenchanted with leadership decisions, so they broke off and created their own pre-conference. I'm thinking specifically the Women's Center pre-conference membership that I used to be affiliated with, and they're doing their own day, organizing their own day around what they would like to see because they felt the larger Women's Studies conference wasn't addressing their needs. And so that's great, because it's really grassroots. It's really coming from them. They're beginning to make their own decisions about what that looks like. And so the challenge, though, is always going to be the funding, the structure, the support, because people might rely on a big name like Iron Man because they already know it, or people want to shy away from gender issues, quite frankly, like even though they know it impacts them, but I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to be a problem, I don't want to be affiliated with, making waves or making noise. I just want to get in there and do my Iron Man competition. So I think trying to, impress upon people how we can make it better for everyone and that they all have a stake in this and it impacts everybody's lives, whether or not, it's in a very tangible way that they can feel kind of in their everyday existence, that these questions are actually in an effort to make it all better for everybody.
And it's not just about women, right? So it's the responsibility of all of us, no matter how we identify our gender, to try and rectify some of these imbalances and these disparities that we've been talking about. Yeah. Well, there's a lot here, obviously, and we could probably talk for the next 3 hours about this issue. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today, Joanna. It's been a really thoughtful and informative conversation, and I think also has identified some really tangible ways that we can make a difference, whether that's where we put our consumer dollars, whether that's talking about these issues with our friends and colleagues, or whether it's timing people in meetings to identify who are the people that get the most space and time in a room. It's something that we can look to change in our own personal lives and our own personal spheres of influence as we move forward.
Yes. And I want to say I'm so grateful for the opportunity just to have the forum to talk about these issues. And I hope that the conversation inspires people to continue on in their own lives.
All right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good day.
So lots of takeaways from today's conversation with Joanna Snawder-Manzo, as I just mentioned. We would love to hear from you and love for you to share your thoughts and continue this conversation. I encourage you to remember that just because you may not see sexism and the marginalization of women every day, or you don't feel perhaps that you personally experience it, it doesn't mean it isn't there. It is often running in the background and influencing all that we do. So please post your comments, ask your questions, or send your ideas using the WISP Facebook page. We really do want to start a meaningful conversation about these important issues. You can also send your comments directly to info@wispsports.com if you would prefer to do so anonymously. And there is a ton more information and more conversations happening about the world of women's sports on the WISP Sports website, which is wispsports.com. And you can also follow us on social media @WISP Sports, and you can follow me @TryToDefy. Thank you so much, and see you next time.